The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
It's now my pleasure to turn to domestic issues and talk on topics closer to home. And this comes and rings right to my heart as being a DHSer. And when we start talking about critical infrastructure and the risk to critical infrastructure, I'd love to first jump in with Todd Sullivan, who is the Chief Risk Officer for the Financial Services Sector at the Analysis and Resilience Center for Systemic Risk, the ARC, and Mr. Steve Pugh, the CIO for Intercontinental Exchange, which is the parent company of the New York Stock Exchange. These are two great representatives to have this conversation with. And I'd like to welcome also the Suzanne back to continue this conversation. And what we'll do is we'll bring this in to have this topic here. The tease here is I did give both these gentlemen a bit of a question in advance, and it was, you know, if you're sitting back and looking at your choice by dealing with the operational concerns of the day, you're really looking at that tactical layer. We saw what happens with a Colonial Pipeline, but for most of us that are in the industry, we weren't waiting for a Colonial Pipeline to happen. We knew that this was a potential for critical infrastructure to be impacted, but it really drove the subject of systemic risk to the top of everybody's list. So when we're talking about systemic risk out there and critical functions being degraded or disrupted, knowing that both of you have this as a real priority, we'll just start with you, Steve. What are the recent developments you've seen to really see people moving in the direction of systemic risk, and how are they really trying to address these now?
Hey, Matt, thanks for having us on for this really important topic and something that we're pretty excited to talk about. As you mentioned, Colonial Pipeline was certainly a wake-up call, but it wasn't the first. Thinking back to the Saudi Aramco issues and destructive malware, I mean, we've seen this happen a lot. It continues to become more prevalent. And so, there's a few things that I'd like to highlight, and I think they're really a good news story. You've heard about General Alexander talking about collaboration and sharing, sort of this team sport, and we fully believe that, especially at ICE. And so I think one of the big things we've seen over the last year specifically is this collaboration within the governments. And so we saw Director Inglis being nominated and confirmed, and Director Easterly and Ann Neuberger on the NSC. And so you're seeing a lot of important positions now around cybersecurity, and really stitching all of those together. And so with the DHS CISA's joint JCDC, the Joint Defense Collaborative, I think that's a huge function. And then also with Todd, Todd and I talk often. And so with the ARC, which is focused more on financial and energy critical infrastructure, but also like the FSISAC. I mean, these are sort of trade groups, but also government entities that really provide a critical function of early warning, collaboration with other folks that are fighting the same battles that we are. Sitting in my role, I understand that, I may be a target, but the target of me looks a lot like the target of my peers. And so the more that we can partner together, the stronger we all become. I think Director Inglis says to defeat one of us, she must defeat all of us. And that's really a great mantra to move forward with. I think the other things that we've seen really play out this year, and especially right at the beginning of the year with the Ukraine-Russia conflict kicking off, was CISA's Shields Up campaign, really trying to get in front of the problem and remind people what they need to be doing. They've got the Stop Ransomware initiative and other things like that. And then most recently, the cybersecurity performance goals. And the thing that I've noticed through all of those is, there's not any like this like black magic, dark magic, special stuff. I mean, it's really quite basic. And to me, the message is really, if you can get the basics right, it solves for a number of other issues. And so, if you're protecting down on the easy stuff, it frees up resources for the more advanced things. And then also, I think the other thing that we're seeing is the regulatory environment changing. And so while I operate in the financial markets, financial infrastructure specifically, the critical infrastructure of the U.S. is different for energy. It's different across the board. There's different levels of maturity and different problem sets. And so the regulatory environment in finance is very robust, and it's probably the more mature of all the regulatory environments. And so we're seeing that sort of play out, going from more of a recommendation of cyber initiatives to more of a thou shalt and more directive. And so I think all of those things are going to continue to play out in 2023 and beyond. But I do think we've made a lot of good progress over the last few years. And I think we'll continue to see the strengths in finance trickle down into other industries, and better partnerships and deeper partnerships. So I'll leave that there. Turn over to Todd.
All right. Thanks. And Todd, I don't want you to try and predict the future, but that's usually what they ask us with systemic risk is, what do we need to look for down that range? So I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a predicting the future, but building on what Steve said, I think that the key is our industry, especially financial services, has taken this responsibility serious for a long time. For better than a decade, major financial institutions have spent a lot of time and energy and resources on resiliency, recovery plans, whether it's from physical disaster to cyber disaster to other business continuity disruptions. What has changed in the last sort of half dozen plus years has been this idea of collaboration across the industry, recognizing we all leverage very similar infrastructure, whether it's financial services infrastructure or broader, national and international infrastructure. So things like, other critical industries. And what the work we do at places like the ARC has done is allowed for industry to collaborate and think about the risks between buildings. Steve and his team at the ICE obviously are responsible for and have phenomenal plans for how to respond to a whole series of disruptions to their own business individually. But the way that others rely on him as a provider of critical industry or critical infrastructure is a place where you need industry-wide collaboration. And so I think that shift from inside your own four walls, being concerned specifically about your own recovery, resolution, and resiliency plans, and shifting to a focus of what does the industry need, what does the whole U.S. economy need to be able to remain resilient, has been I think a very valuable learning experience for our industry. And as Steve suggested, I think it will serve as an example for other critical infrastructure. We've done a lot of work together with our government partners and with other critical industries over the last 2 years, examining common risks, common assumptions in recovery planning, and being able to do that in a scenario-based, analytical, quantitative wherever possible, to figure out what are the impacts and what has to be dealt with in order to provide for resilience and national security. I think that if there's I don't want to quote Director Inglis again, but if there's another soundbite to leave people with, I think it's this concept that we have moved from focusing on what's probable to what's possible, and so making sure that we're thinking through and creating plans for the entire scope of what's possible. Right, those black swan, unintended, long tail events have to be more seriously considered now, and they're the place where uniquely a collaborative, industry-wide, non-competitive solution is probably most valuable.
Yeah, and Matt, if I could just jump in on something Todd said, which I think is really important, and that's on the topic of diversity. It's something that I think a lot of hiring managers and something we certainly preach is like, go hire a really diverse team because that'll make you stronger, and you want diversity of thought and things like that. And what Todd and the ARC and other similar groups have been able to do is really get folks like me and my peers together, and we all have diversity of thought. And so while I may be looking at a problem, I might not be thinking about it like somebody else, other CISOs. And so being able to get together and think about these things that are now possible, and talk about them and think about them in a really sort of a structured environment has been hugely beneficial, I think, for the collective financial and energy sector. But I think as we can replicate that out to other critical infrastructures and critical sectors, the Section 9 as we call them, I think there's a lot of power in that diversity of getting together and thinking about a problem in new and unique ways.
Well, and when we start talking about that, we don't want to paint a boogeyman of some of these risks, but at the same time, we really have to elevate them. And it feels like right now we do have leadership's attention. So when we're talking about boardrooms, they've heard ransomware, they've seen Russian attacks, they now know some of the criticalities of some of these measures and those risks to each other, a lot of the whole sector wide type implications. But if you've seen one system, you've seen one system. How are you addressing things like legacy and emerging technologies to layer in with some of these systemic approaches? And I'll start with you, Todd, this time.
Yeah, so I think this is a place where, as we look at the way in which firms within our industries, as well as more generally the whole U.S. commercial sector, has embraced technologies like cloud over the last 10 years, you think about the efficiency gains and the resilience gains you get from that. But what we hadn't probably spent enough attention on is, what are the trade-offs? What are What are the unintended consequences, or perhaps the new or novel risks or vulnerabilities that come with using new technology? And we've used that as an opportunity to get in front of, as you think about ways in which distributed ledger and other kind of emerging technologies might be explored as ways to innovate in financial infrastructure. Start having those questions up front, having those conversations up front with government partners, with experts, with threat and intelligence knowledgeable folks to make sure that we're considering the potential risks and impacts. And I think that would have been hard to get into an innovator's talking points early on in a world maybe 10, 15 years ago. It would have been much more difficult to start thinking proactively about threats, vulnerabilities, and risks in a world that hadn't been through what we have been through over the last 10 years. And I think that shift of focus and that willingness for people to explore that might not be how it was designed, but it could be how it could be exploited, is worth having up front, and not after we've built out and fully deployed some new technology or innovation in a way that creates unintended consequence or unintended attack surface.
And I'll put that to you the same, Steve. Have you seen the same in your world?
Yeah, it's certainly true that I think the board is much more engaged on cyber nowadays, and not just in my current role, just sort of the maturation of boards and their awareness of cybersecurity. Part of that was education, part of it was just awareness. And I think the conversations we have today are much more robust and engaging. And when I talk to the boards and things like that, I'm not necessarily trying to do the whole boogeyman and the fear, uncertainty, and doubt dance. I do want to allay some concerns, but really we talk about, to the board at least, the level of risk. And when we talk about risk, I really try to cage it in two things. And kind of to your point, it's like, the first is like, do I have the right level of visibility for risk with respect to cybersecurity of the organization? Because unless you can like answer that definitively, you really don't have a fulsome conversation. Sort of the Donald Rumsfeld's, you don't know what you don't know. And like, if you're trying to measure and quantify risk, if you have an unknown variable, that kind of defeats the purpose. So once I can get comfortable and then I can convey that to the board that I have the right level of visibility of the risk, then we can start talking about, do we have the right level of control? And so, realizing that this is sort of on a spectrum and we're never going to be 100%, how do we set ourselves up for success based on what we know? And so whether it's a legacy system or whether it's a brand new system, to Todd's point, we got this amazing new technology. Visibility really is key. And depending on what it is, that looks different. But getting the right level of visibility of the risk and understanding that's at least where you can start.
Yeah, I think that what I'll add, Matt, that if there's a silver lining to facing nation state adversaries over a prolonged period of time, it has removed the stigma from discussing what could be the art of the possible vulnerability, right? It used to be extremely unsettling for an enterprise to think about, well, if a bad actor can do that to me, well, then we've done something wrong. We left ourselves exposed. We haven't done our job. When you're talking about facing a nation state adversary who can put that kind of capability and resources in 1,000 pounds of pressure on a 1 square inch area, that's beyond what any private enterprise is supposed to be able to defend against in the United States. And it allows for the more open sharing and conversation around, okay, well, what happens if that is the outcome, right? As opposed to the sort of hypothetical that was always the bad actor operating out of somebody's mom's basement, trying to do some things to steal. That feels like a lack of responsibility if you leave yourself vulnerable to systemic disruption from that. But when you're facing off against a nation state adversary who has no concept of rules or restrictions, what it does is it disarms the conversation about talking about that as a possible outcome. And I think that's been incredibly valuable to get people to come to the table and share more openly, like, yes, I have no vulnerability to those individual bad actors, but if you tell me there's a whole nation state coming after me, you can't reasonably expect me to defend that, as an independent organization.
And you're really referring to the government role in a lot of this. And I guess when you have the opportunity to ask,
I think it's most importantly, it's the partnership between the two.
Right. And that's my point is if you have the ARC and the New York Stock Exchange here, I guess you can give a pretty good report card of how that partnership is looking. So how would you rate some of the government interactions you've had recently? And I know we just heard from Steve on some of the regulators really being in there and doing their part, but are you getting what you need? And are there any future spaces where you'd like to see more from the government?
Yeah, well, I'll speak a little bit forward-looking, but optimistically. We've got some great partners in our sector risk management agency, which is the U.S. Treasury. They've been really forward-leaning and working with us as an industry. They also chair the FIBIC, which is the broader regulatory organization, and the partnership between the FISIC and the FIBIC, which are a lot of acronyms here, but private sector, public sector, working together. There really is a very clear understanding this only gets done collaboratively. And so, our partners across Treasury and within the broader regulatory environment have been incredibly helpful. We have a lot more to do, but I think it's definitely heading in the right direction. We've got the right positive engagement. We're not facing, pushback or resistance, which is all you can ask for, I think, in a world where the rules change every day.
And Steve, you mentioned the cyber goals. I think that's setting a good baseline for all of our industry partners that aren't all the way advanced, that have sort of that medium and small business kind of supply chain, if you will, all the way down from their cyber controls. Are you seeing that the government relationship and that industry partnership is extending out down your supply chain as well?
Yeah, we really have. I mean, I think it's been very encouraging. I mean, I remember when the private sector was just really demanding anything, help, something. And then to see how far we've come and the willingness that Todd mentioned. Todd Conklin, we work with a lot on the Department of Treasury side, has been fantastic, really leaning in, wanting to help, wanting to do more, Director Easterly as well. And so, I think there's a lot of goodness there. There is always more to do. As everybody knows on this call today, this landscape changes daily, if not hourly. And so there will always be more to do. But I think that willingness and that partnership and those relationships are key. And the thing that I would sort of leave this group with is that there are a ton of industry groups like the ARC, FSISAC, and others, as well as going direct to like CISA or whatever your critical infrastructure lead is. There are a tremendous amount of services to take advantage of, and I think we can only get better by continuing to use those, provide feedback, and that gets better and better for everybody else that might come after us. But there's always more work to do. But I'm really encouraged by what I've seen over the past year, especially sitting in this role as the CISO for ICE.
All right. Well, thank you very much to both of you. This has been a great conversation. We'll definitely have to bring it back up, and thank you for being great partners as we move forward.